Good morning and welcome to everybody to this webinar on what ivermectin has taught us during this pandemic. The ivermectin debate has polarized both the lay and the scientific community and has damaged the relationship between science and society. One scientist may state publicly that ivermectin obliterates the SARS-CoV-2 virus, and another will call it snake oil. One scientist will state that there is no research in ivermectin and COVID treatment, and another will present rigorously produced meta-analyses and systematic reviews on several research papers that have already been completed from across the globe. One scientist may say ivermectin causes blindness and death, and another will show evidence of disinformation. Meanwhile, the public has access to ivermectin and is using it, and the evidence they use is anecdotal. It's the voice notes that people are sending on WhatsApp groups that have claimed their overnight cures. It's their Facebook groups, etc. In this webinar, we will attempt to make sense of ivermectin through hearing from a clinician who has prescribed ivermectin for some time, an academic who knows how medicine should work in our country, and a public health scientist who has experienced in how hard it is to get some scientists and authorities to see science. So we're going to start off by listening to Professor Anisa Mosam, who has been prescribing ivermectin for some time. Anisa, over to you.
Thanks, Colleen. I'm just trying to share screen. There we go. Thanks, Colleen, and thank you for the opportunity to speak on ivermectin. I'm not sure, is my video, I can't seem to...
Yes, we can see it clearly, Anita.
Okay, thanks. Yeah, thanks for the opportunity to speak on ivermectin. I know it's really been in the spotlight, as you have mentioned, during the pandemic, and really it has been, come under the microscope, in the lay public as well as in the medical fraternity. I just wanted to take a few steps back and look at how ivermectin was discovered, what it was used for, its successes in veterinary medicine, and then how it was repurposed for successful use in tropical dermatoses and then in scabies, and its efficacy in these conditions. Okay, so ivermectin is really a derivative of the avermectins. It's a fermentation product of the actinomycete Streptomyces avermetilis, and it was discovered initially in Japanese soil in the 1970s. It's only been discovered there. It was found to have highly active broad-spectrum anti-parasitic effect. It is an anti-parasitic agent discovered by a Japanese professor, Omura. And basically, it was its impact later on as one of the most broadly used drugs in global health that actually won him the 2015 Nobel Prize in Physiology and Medicine. So at least 3.7 billion doses have been safely administered as part of Merck's donation program. So really, there aren't many drugs that can lay the claim to being a wonder drug. And two of these that have really stood the test of time are penicillin and aspirin because of their beneficial effect on mankind. Ivermectin was initially used as a veterinary drug, and it was found to be active against ectoparasites and endoparasites, especially for livestock and pets. And based on this, on its use and its success in veterinary medicine, it was actually called a blockbuster drug. Soon after that, and because of its anti-parasitic activity, it was used in onchocerciasis. Onchocerciasis and then lymphatic filariasis, which are one of the two most devastating and disabling tropical dermatoses, really, which have ravaged impoverished communities, in Africa and Asia and India, And in the 1970s, it was endemic in about 34 countries, affecting about 17 million individuals. And the effects of this, because onchocerciasis, or commonly called river blindness, affected the visual ability, at least 40% in communities had some visual disability. So it affected their personal health, the health of communities, their productivity, their ability to farm. And so it was really through the ivermectin that its use, and it changed the lives of these individuals, improved nutrition, health for billions of people, mainly in these communities. And that was one of the reasons it was called a wonder drug and earned Professor O'Mara the Nobel Prize. In some have actually cited it as an ideal drug in the sense that it's cheap, it's safe, it's well tolerated, it can be given in a single dose, it has a broad spectrum of activity, and there has been no drug resistance despite its use as monotherapy. So, it has a broad spectrum. There are several biological mechanisms by which ivermectin works. We know that it has been used as an antiparasitic in animals. It also has some antibacterial, anti-cancer activity, and antiviral activity. And most of its activity has been found against RNA viruses like the Zika virus, influenza virus, yellow fever, and dengue virus, and also the SARS virus. And based on its antiviral capabilities and also somewhat its anti-inflammatory activities, it has been, it has come up as an agent now that can be active or that might be useful in the fight against COVID-19. So this is just showing you that it is on the WHO essential drug list. Initially in the 1980s, specifically for onchocerciasis, following on that lymphatic filariasis, and then a host of other endoparasites ranging from strongyloides to hookworm, and then later on for use in the ectoparasite scabies. So this is just showing you, its use for onchocerciasis, which causes significant skin and eye disability. And here it's really been cited as one of the greatest public health campaigns globally. It's one of the longest running successful public health campaigns. In terms of filariasis, this is the second most common vector-borne disease after malaria, causes significant disability, especially with limitation of mobility, and it has a huge impact in the lives of patients affected with onchocerciasis and filariasis. In terms of other ectoparasites, it's been effective, on the WHO essential drug list for whoopworm, strongyloidiasis, and then ectoparasites like scabies and head lice, and more recently, other dermatological conditions which are inflammatory like rosacea, where it's used in a topical preparation. So ivermectin use in scabies, it's certainly not first-line therapy, it is second-line therapy. Topicals are the first line, but it's useful in outbreaks for control, encrusted scabies, as seen in this picture where a person is infected with millions of mites, immunocompromised individuals, and where there's a difficulty in application of topicals. The effective dose in scabies, in classic scabies, is 200 microgram per kilogram, used at day 1, and then usually repeated either at any time between day 7 and day 14. And it has been well established in several guidelines. For example, this is one which shows you for classic scabies, the doses, as I've mentioned, day 1 and then any time between day 8 and 15. And in crusted scabies, the dosing frequency is increased, where the same dose is used, but at least 3 doses in 1 week, or 5 doses in 2 weeks, or at least 7 doses in the period of a month. So this is where our experience, with treating scabies using ivermectin, started. And usually, the use has been established in tropical countries where especially there's a high prevalence. However, it was approved for use in France in 2001. It is still mainly off-label in the USA, UK, and Australia. However, to date, there have been no serious adverse events that have been reported for its use in scabies. So again, here it's been used by dermatologists in the country for the last 5 years, available through a compounding pharmacy and at a dose of 200 microgram per kilogram. And this is the efficacy after a single dose, day 1 and then day 7 of therapy. And one can see how effective this must be with the millions of mites that would be inhabiting a plaque of scabies. So the response is certainly quite dramatic, and you can understand why it would need to be used, especially to prevent outbreaks in wards and in communities. In terms of the safety data, most of the data comes from the onchocerciasis control programs. So here there's been mass drug administration with at least 3.7 billion dosages worldwide over the last 30 years. And in some patients have received up to 20 annual doses. So dosages of up to 2,000 microgram per kilogram, that's 10 times the dose that it has been used for in scabies, has been used safely in onchocerciasis. For its use in onchocerciasis, the majority of adverse events have been mild. Fever, myalgia, headache, dizziness, rash, those are usually the mild adverse events that have been experienced with onchocerciasis. Severe reactions have been documented like lethargy, confusion, and coma. However, the side effects are from heavy infestation related to parasite deaths instead of drug toxicity. So the neurological side effects occur. There's a possibility due to the mode of action of ivermectin. However, this has been observed mainly experimentally and in animals where there's a rare homozygous mutation which causes deficiency in a phosphorylated glycoprotein, and this has not been recorded in humans. In terms of children, it is not recommended for children under the weight of 15 kilograms or less than 5 years because of lack of data and because of the potential for neurotoxicity. However, there's been increasing evidence to demonstrate safety in children as well. These are 2 studies. The first study was a French one looking at treatment of children with scabies, age range between 1 and 64 months and under 15 kilograms. And the mean dose here was 220 micrograms per kilograms. Only 4 adverse events were documented: flare-up of the eczema, some vomiting and diarrhea, none were serious. The other one was used, this was published in the New England Journal, 54 children under the age of 5 years, and here children were treated for head lice at double that dosage, so 400 microgram per kilogram, without any adverse events being recorded. So in terms of pregnancy, it's categorized as a category C drug, which means it is not for use in pregnant women. However, this systematic review and meta-analysis looked at the inadvertent use during these mass drug administration. So there are at least 500 pregnant women in the study who were exposed to ivermectin inadvertently, and there were no adverse outcomes that were recorded for the fetus. In terms of higher doses of ivermectin, so this study looked at, it was a double-blind placebo-controlled dose escalation study, which was designed specifically to assess the CNS effects and general toxicity. And the adverse events were found to be similar between ivermectin and placebo, did not increase with dose. So ivermectin was found to be well tolerated. There was no associated CNS toxicity for doses up to 10 times the highest FDA-approved dose. However, this was in healthy adult subjects. Here, higher doses were used in children with acute myelogenous leukemia. And here, high doses of up to 1 milligram per kilogram were used for prolonged periods up to 6 months in combination with chemotherapy. And there no serious adverse events were found that could be attributed to ivermectin. So certainly ivermectin has been established for use in certain protocols worldwide. It has been shown to be of benefit in pre-exposure, post-exposure prophylaxis in the early symptomatic phase, as well as in the pulmonary or inflammatory phase. Here it's been used or advocated at the same doses that we've used it for in scabies and in other conditions. And finally, so it certainly has, it's part of the toolbox that, that is available for doctors to use it in COVID-19. The final few points is that it's on the WHO essential drug list. As part of the mass drug administration, there's been at least 3.7 billion doses that have been administered globally. Safety has been established at doses of 200 to 2,000 microgram per kilogram. And this has been in onchocerciasis. So these are patients who have got a chronic underlying condition, who are malnourished. And the side effects in this group were found to be mild, transient. Data shows some efficacy in children as well. And certainly it is one of the drugs which can be used in COVID-19. And in South Africa, it is now available through a Section 21 application. Just want to acknowledge all these people who have contributed in terms of publications or in terms of the patient information as well. Thank you.
Many thanks, Anissa, for that very comprehensive introduction to what ivermectin is. There are some hands up in the chat. We're going to entertain questions after all the presentations. So please, if you've got a question, please put them into the chat box. I'm going to introduce our next speaker, Dr. Andy Gray, who has got background into how drugs can be used in our country. So handing over to you, Andy.
Thank you very much, Colleen, and good morning, everyone. So my remit today is to talk about two aspects, medicine selection and medicines regulation in South Africa. Just a couple of disclaimers. I'm a member of the National Essential Medicines List Committee, the COVID-19 Subcommittee, and the NDOH-NICD Clinical Guidelines Committee, and I chair one of the committees at SAPRA and serve on two of the others. But I'm speaking here as an independent academic and not on behalf of any of those structures or government. We've posed the question, what have we learned? I think we've learned that there are many misperceptions about the structures and the processes involved in medicines registration and selection in South Africa, and I hope I can clear up some of those very quickly. If we look at the classic drug management cycle, running from selection through procurement, distribution, and use, deciding which drugs are going to be available within a health system is the first of those decisions. In South Africa, in the public sector, that is done by the National Essential Medicines List Committee, which is informed by a series of expert review committees. The situation in our private sector is far more fragmented. So different medical schemes have different formularies and benefit packages, and they may or may not reimburse for medicines. They are constrained by the prescribed minimum benefits and some algorithms for chronic diseases. But that's a minority of the diseases treated in ambulatory care. So the main point here is that not everything that is available on the market and is registered is procured in the state, nor is it reimbursed in the private sector. However, deciding to select a medicine depends on its legal availability within the market. And that is the registration, regulation, inspection role of our National Medicines Regulatory Authority. So how have we changed in response to COVID? This is a paper in SAMJ last year where those of us involved in this process have documented how we've attempted to speed up the reviews of evidence in relation to COVID. And we've really tried, whenever there is a question that guidelines are wanting to answer, to get the evidence within a week or so to try and put that into the debate. That link on the bottom right will take you to all of the COVID-19 rapid reviews that have been published. That feeds into a clinical guideline committee, and it also gets endorsed by the National Essential Medicines List Committee and informs government decisions by the incident management team. In fact, this entire process started because of the demand that was being felt in the country for access to chloroquine early in March of 2020. And when that evidence was reviewed, a recommendation was made not to provide chloroquine in the public sector. What we also do is, in the rapid reviews, we follow an evidence to decision framework. We talk about the certainty of the evidence. For efficacy and safety, we try to look at the feasibility of any intervention within the public sector in particular, what the resource implications would be, what values and preferences there are from both clinicians and patients, and that's often quite difficult to document, and then try to see whether including something would either advance or retard equity. So what about the registration? How do products get to market? SAHPRA, the South African Health Products Regulatory Authority, is an independent NMRA. It's located outside of the National Department of Health and, in fact, outside of the public service. It's responsible for medicines, both for human and animal use, and that's veterinary medicines, not stock remedies and agricultural remedies. For medical devices, in vitro diagnostics, on a different set of law. It's also looking at radionuclides on behalf of the Department of Health, and it regulates clinical trials. The decision-making is vested in the staff, not the board. It's the staff who take the decisions. The board is there as a fiduciary and strategic instrument. But the CEO, who nominally is taking those final decisions, is enabled to appoint advisory committees which make recommendations to the staff. In the Medicines and Related Substances Act, Section 14 prohibits the sale of medicines, medical devices, and IVDs which are subject to registration and are not registered. So there are two steps to the process: a call-up, a declaration that something is registrable, and then the process of registration. All category A medicines, so medicines for human use, apart from complementary medicines, but including all biological medicines and vaccines, have been the subject of a call-up notice. So this started in 1967. It took until about 1985 to get through all pharmacological categories. The only alternative is a Section 21 approval for access to an unregistered medicine. And that is implicit in a clinical trial approval, but it can also be given for individual patients on motivation by their clinicians. And it is also used for bulk approvals. For example, if a registered product is not available, and largely it's where the state needs that product and no one else is able to supply it, then a bulk approval is given by SAHPRA to import an unregistered version of that medicine. The regulatory authority by law is only allowed to look at three aspects: the quality, the safety, and the efficacy. So quality is about how the medicine is made, not only a first batch, but how quality will be assured during ongoing production and also during distribution of that medicine. The safety elements come from non-clinical and clinical data. There might, as that product is used on the market, be additional data that come from post-marketing surveillance. We would learn more, for example, as Anissa showed, of how use in pregnancy happens when it's inadvertent, for example. In terms of vaccines, these are called adverse events following immunization, or AEFIs. And for new drugs that come to market, there is a risk management plan that proposes how these data will be gathered. Part of that safety assessment is the decision on scheduling. How would that medicine become available on the market? Is it something that you can buy in any retail shop, or is it something only available from a pharmacy, or is it something that is prescription only, or even controlled even more rigorously than that? And lastly, its efficacy. Does the medicine achieve its proposed purpose? And are there important differences in effect between patient groups? And those are assessments that rely predominantly on the clinical trials in phases 1, 2, and 3. And for most medicines, the regulator would be looking for 2 independently powered phase 3 studies before registering a medicine. So who makes that decision, and where and how is it done? So a dossier is submitted in what's called the Common Technical Document format. It goes through an internal screening process to make sure that all the pieces are there. And then it is broken up into elements to a series of either external evaluators or advisory committee members or internal staff members who review that evidence and looking at a particular element. So the Pharmaceutical and Analytical Committee would be looking at the quality issues. The Scheduling Committee would be looking predominantly at safety, but also at efficacy. That is then subjected to a peer review. And if there is a difference of opinion, there is a committee discussion about that, and a recommendation that is then made to the authority. And within the authority, together with the senior management, a final decision is made. That results in the issuing of a certificate of registration, which comes with conditions. So those conditions might be ongoing data collection, ongoing reporting from trials that are still being conducted, a pediatric investigation plan, for example, if evidence is not there yet for children. There are also conditions related to quality, stability studies, and how that data will be provided going forward. Lastly, there's attention to the labeling. So what is the information that will be given both to professionals in the form of the professional information, the PI, and to patients in the patient information leaflet? The price is not something that SAHPRA deals with. The initial single exit price, if it's going to be sold to the private sector, is set entirely by the manufacturer or importer of that medicine. And it's only the annual increase in that SEP, which is regulated by the minister. What has changed since 2015, and this law came into effect in 2017, and SAHPRA has been using it since it was established in 2018, is the possibility of reliance. So SAHPRA is able to liaise with other regulatory authorities, and it can enter into agreements to cooperate with other regulatory authorities. And rather than repeating some of the assessments of the data, it can rely on the reports written by major regulators that are considered to be stringent or mature regulators. And in particular, South Africa would follow what is done at the US FDA, the European Medicines Agency, Swissmedic, the Australian Therapeutic Goods Administration, and the UK MHRA. So this enables regulatory decisions to be made faster and avoids duplication of effort. So I'm happy to take questions at the end about the regulatory process and how it's being applied in this country. And thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Andy, for that. I think there have been a lot of questions as to why SAHPRA hasn't just allowed us to use Ivermectin, and there are very good reasons, and thank you for laying them out for us. Our next speaker is Dr. Warren Parker, who is a public health specialist who spent a lot of time last year making sure that we're wearing masks today to prevent further infection rates. Handing over to you, Warren. Thank you.
Thanks, Colleen. All right. Good. Okay, so today I'm going to try and draw a link between my experiences in getting face masks into public policy, I guess, and my experiences working alongside others, looking at Ivermectin as a possible therapy for COVID-19. So just to take us back, I think it's hard to imagine, but in December 2019, this is pretty much when the pandemic started. And very soon after it became clear that there were these unexpected cases of pneumonia, there was a rapid response in East Asia. So in China, there was a rapid response around curtailing movement, limiting public gatherings. dealing with hygiene, promoting hygiene, such as hand hygiene, and promoting face masks. And similar measures actually were scaled up very quickly in the rest of East Asia or the rest of the region. So in Taiwan, they halted face mask exports and scaled up production, apart from these other measures. South Korea took face masks seriously as well and went on a distribution drive. Hong Kong reported 95% uptake of face masks in the early phase of the epidemic. And these strategies came out of the East Asian experience of other respiratory epidemics, such as SARS and influenza. Then around about February, late in February, the World Health Organization developed some guidelines around prevention, including in relation to face masks and other measures. So they prioritized hand hygiene and cleaning of surfaces. And this was derived from the basic general hygiene measures for disease prevention. But if you look at the evidence for that, it was actually quite weak. There wasn't much evidence for community level prevention of a respiratory virus. In any event, that was the one guideline, and it was quite highly prioritized. Secondly, coughing and sneezing into an elbow. And if you look for the evidence of that, there's not really much at all. And in fact, when someone did a trial on it, they didn't find it very effective at all. Avoiding touching the face is based on the idea that there's fomite transfer, that you can transfer the virus from surfaces. And there's actually minimal evidence to support that. And then physical distancing. So their guidance there was that greater than 1 meter distance can be considered to be safe because it's droplet spread. Although other evidence suggests that particles travel further, and we actually have quite good evidence on this now. I'm focusing on what the evidence was in 2019 or prior to that. So this is what they were working with. And then they also did not recommend face masks for general use, based on the assumption that the only way the virus spread was through symptomatic spread. So that's where we were as far as the prevention guidance went. And I'm sure all of you would remember seeing the adverts and so on promoting these things. Now, the strangest thing was that although China and other territories and countries in East Asia prioritized face masks, the WHO, for reasons that are unclear, did not prioritize face masks. So they actually singled out face masks as being problematic. So they said a medical mask is not required, or any face mask is not required for people who are not ill, as there's no evidence of the usefulness. Wearing medical masks when not indicated may result in unnecessary costs, and because we know that anyone could make a cloth face mask without involving procurement burden. We also know that factories could be repurposed to very cheaply produce face masks and so on. So that was somewhat problematic. It was kind of over exceptionalizing the negatives of face masks. They also said masks create a false sense of security, which if you think about hand washing or any of the other measures, you could apply the same rule or discard this notion. There's certainly no evidence that face masks create a false sense of security. And someone actually went to the trouble of looking for the evidence and couldn't find it. So I'm not quite sure how that concept cropped up, but it was out there in the discourse. And then wearing a face mask would lead to the neglect of other essential measures, such as hand hygiene practices. Again, you could say hand hygiene could lead to you not using a face mask. So a bit odd there. And then using a mask incorrectly may hamper its effectiveness. Well, it applies to any measure. So why exceptionalize there? So it was a bit strange that face masks got picked out as being somewhat different. And this theme carried through globally. So we saw the US Surgeon General saying, stop buying masks, they're not effective, they don't work, healthcare workers need them. So part of the underlying reason for not promoting face masks was that people felt that they would undermine the needs in the healthcare system. But at the same time, there's a difference between saying we need them for the healthcare system because they work and saying in public that no one else needs them. And you'll see there as well, no reason walking around with a mask. There was actually Anthony Fauci in the early stages of the response. And then I'd actually arrived in South Africa from the US to do some work in Kenya. And so I'd done a lot of research on the risks of as part of that trip, because I needed to go off and interview people in the country. So I'd done a review of face masks prior to this period. And I was kind of shocked to suddenly see the Minister of Health, Provincial Minister of Health, saying that face masks were a major problem and it'll spread the virus faster. And if I went into the stores, there was a big sign saying the World Health Organization work, so we're not going to use them, etc. So again, this is a kind of odd space to be in the context of the evidence around this possible intervention measure. And in fact, we really had a battle trying to move policy on face masks, because the early phase of the epidemic in South Africa occurred in retail outlets and factories as outbreaks. So here we had the policy actually leading to a very clear line between the policy and the outbreaks, which was problematic. Interestingly, the evidence into Spanish flu, there'd been a key measure responding to SARS and H1N1 and other respiratory epidemics to face masks, and this again should be thought of as the body of research supporting their use. Wearing a face mask is seen as a social responsibility to avoid infecting others, and it promotes a sense of solidarity. When you see others wearing face masks, one feels like one's part of the same epidemic response, which is important in controlling an epidemic. Then research on face masks in the peer-reviewed literature pre-COVID is actually incredibly strong. Face masks are shown to be effective in the context of influenza transmission, beneficial in close proximity settings, effective in preventing transmission of influenza during the Hajj. Cloth masks are recommended in the context of an epidemic if medical masks weren't available, and there was a very high-level systematic review. Cloth masks are relevant in community settings, and homemade masks were shown to be highly effective at preventing droplet or viral spread. So this incredible body of evidence was contradicted by the policy. So public health response, I was drawn into working on the national committee that was looking at face masks. And then also working with various people on making face masks at home and so on, and also interacting with people in health departments in other countries. So what we saw there, as you will recall as well, the rapid mobilization of people into making and distributing face masks. And this happened around March onwards. In countries like Czechia, in South Africa, homemade face masks grew rapidly. And in a number of countries, there was a gradual acceptance of face masks as part of the strategy. In South Africa, we managed to move policy through in around mid-April. And it was challenging. There were people who opposed face masks in senior positions in South Africa. Papers about how face masks didn't work, etc. So there was resistance there. And surprisingly also, and I did engage with WHO directly around their decision making. I shared the data and evidence, and yet they only changed the guidance in their June meeting and not when there was an earlier opportunity in April. So what contributed to the change? Well, there was a popular mobilization. People were worried. They saw solutions beyond what the official guidance was. And there was a rapid popular mobilization. As far as on the policy side, it was really acknowledging that there's a body of evidence. So it wasn't just the biomedical RCT type of evidence that was seen as relevant, but these other things, the social function of mask wearing and so on. And then obviously scientific activism, lobbying, and the cumulative changes in country policies as the countries started adopting face masks. as a policy, other countries followed. But the effects of this poor policy were clearly counterproductive. Many infections could have been prevented, and the epidemic could have been slowed. And this is a major, major failing in this pandemic. We really shouldn't have been where we are. To say nothing of the influence of politics and other factors in mask wearing later on, particularly in the US. So let's have a look at ivermectin quickly. So people are justifiably worried about the state of the pandemic. We've also seen, because of that there's been an uncontrolled public use of ivermectin. And in a sense, you can take that as a piece of evidence as well. It means people are not, don't trust the epidemic response, and they feel that they need to take measures themselves. The uncontrolled public use poses health risks and harm. So people are using veterinary product, they have no control, we've got no control over the dosing, etc. And it can be unsafe if used at the incorrect doses, or the incorrect product, or fake products are used. People are exploiting the situation, making money out of it. And there's a lot of stress in the healthcare system. Certainly part of a number of discussion groups that are predominantly made up of doctors working in the response. And there's a huge sense of frustration around ivermectin as a therapeutic option. And also particularly in low-cost settings. I recently saw a shared mail on the response in a rural hospital in KwaZulu-Natal. And there was a discussion about the high rate of deaths for very basic reasons. Dehydration, not controlling the mask, not changing the bedpan, so people were getting up to go to the bathroom and then coming back and not having their masks on, and so on. So a whole lot of unnecessary deaths occurring in a low resource setting. And it makes sense to have a wider range of simpler options, such as therapeutics or drug therapies. Evidence in favor of ivermectin. So everyone's had a look at this in one way or another, but as has been mentioned by Anissa and inferred by Andy, a high safety profile, the mechanism of action for moderating SARS-CoV-2 has been established in research, and I've included the paper at the bottom there. So there's another piece of research. It's not necessarily an RCT. It fits the rationale for repurposing in a COVID-19 context. It fits the bioethical rationale for COVID-19 treatment. It's justifiable for use, for compassionate use. The numerous peer-reviewed and other studies that confirm positive effects, and this positive trend continues. So as part of the work that we're doing around ivermectin, every couple of days we pick up the next paper, and they all seem to go in the same direction, whether or not they're the perfect RCT. But the body of evidence just continues on the same trend. It can be safely administered under medical supervision, and SAHPRA has approved compassionate use based on the research and other inputs into the registration of the product. So I want to just go through a couple of isms that stand in the way. So the one is exceptionalism. So people set a higher bar for ivermectin than the other therapies. And this was something I was seeing with face masks. Hand washing with minimal evidence became the centerpiece of the COVID-19 response. Face masks with good evidence were dismissed as ineffective and ineffectual. So that they were sort of exceptionalized and actually actively run down. Elitism, so failing to take the underlying context into account, dismissing researcher credentials, for example, in many of the studies that are done, typically done not in sort of high-end Western universities or not funded by drug companies. Absolutism, so this idea that only an RCT that's robust and peer-reviewed counts as valid evidence. Skepticism, whatever research is out there isn't good enough. So there's a lot of skepticism about the current research. Conservatism, lack of agility, adaptability, and critical thinking in the context of a severe epidemic. So we need some other rules for responding to COVID-19 as a pandemic and as an epidemic. We can't use the same exact same rules that we have in a non-pandemic context. And then over elaboration. So ivermectin sort of thrust into the foreground as one of the most critical areas of debate. It's just an add-on therapeutic to COVID-19. But some people see it as a huge threat. I know I'm getting close to time, Colleen, so I'm close to the end. This is the last slide. But anyway, lessons from the face mask experience. So I would say popular response deviates from policy response. So people aren't stupid. I mean, they understand things out there, and whether they're informed by social media or other things, there are very real reasons for people to gravitate towards particular types of solution. And they did that around face masks, and people are kind of taking things into their own hands with ivermectin. The evidence to support is strong if assessed as a whole. So I think one has to look beyond RCTs, and there are all sorts of other bits of evidence that makes sense as far as ivermectin and face masks go. Exceptionalism undermines effective response. So once we exceptionalize something, we start really messing up with how we can think clearly about it. For ivermectin, taking all factors into account, urgency, uncontrolled use, the variants that have come up, the third wave, vaccine challenges, risks, the totality of evidence, we need to give it a serious look. The severe stress on healthcare workers and the limited resource environment, again, is an issue we need to take into consideration. Compassionate use means immediate use for treatment, so access must be as easy as any other treatment. If there are a lot of impediments in the way, it's not really compassionate, because healthcare workers are frustrated, and patients are frustrated, and families are frustrated, and people die, and there's a lot of frustration if a perceived treatment wasn't applied. We can continue to explore prophylaxis. So although I was talking about face masks as prevention, here I'm talking about primarily ivermectin as treatment. The research in prophylaxis is there, but it's a little bit more complicated, including the practical aspects. And then there's an opportunity, if it is rolled out effectively and on a widespread basis for treatment, that operational research could become part of the ongoing learning. Great, so that's the end of my presentation. Thanks so much.
Thank you so much for that, Warren, and thank you for staying up to midnight. Warren is in San Diego. Thank you so much for staying up and looking as though you're as fresh as a daisy.
The coffee.
I'd like to draw the three speakers' presentations together with some comments, and then we'll open the floor to questions. Let me just see if I can open this up. So I'd like to knit together two threads from the last century in order for us to understand this current fabric of science and society, and show that we may need to look for a new paradigm for science and society in this century, particularly under pandemic conditions. And this may very well not be our last pandemic of the century. The first thread I'd like to think about is just looking back at the Nuremberg trials, the Tuskegee trials, the thalidomide debacle of the mid-century, and how those led to international science creating these rigorous ethical and scientific methods for research. The double-blind randomized control study became the gold standard for the development of a novel drug, and that's for good reason. However, people are beginning to think that's the only evidence that there should be. However, the second thread I would like to highlight comes from around about 1943, when Fleming published his first paper on injecting a patient with a fatal dose of Streptococcus meningitis with a dose of penicillin. And within 24 hours, the patient started to recover and was fully recovered within a week. So he published that case study in the Lancet in 1943. In that same year, the British War Cabinet set up what was called the Penicillin Committee. And by 1944, there was mass production of penicillin, and it was handed out to Allied forces during the World War. That's before the 1950s. Then move on a couple of decades, and we get to the 80s, and we have Warren and Marshall discovering that Helicobacter pylori causes peptic ulcers. So that's in 1982. Very few people took on that hypothesis, and it led to Marshall actually swallowing a petri dish full of culture taken from somebody's peptic ulcer to show that that's the method of action. And that was in 1984. It took well over a decade before it became recognized that Helicobacter pylori actually causes peptic ulcers. Had we, in those few decades, wrapped ourselves up to hobble ourselves with too much red tape? So now we have another drug which also won a Nobel Award, and it's showing good promise in treating a disease, not just insisting on double-blinded randomized controlled trials. We need a paradigm that takes into consideration both the scientific and ethical rigor, but we don't need it to hobble us. Medicine is for the people, and regulatory authorities are there to protect the people and are not there to be swayed by politics or big pharma. And scientists must respond at this time for the people with an open mind and with humility. We need a new way of thinking about medical research under these emergency conditions. So I'm going to open the floor now to questions. Marianne, are you going to host the questions, or will I find them in the chat?
I'll host them now. So can I go ahead and unmute the first person? Okay, Nakatula, you can go ahead and ask your question. Okay, I think Nakatula has disappeared. Cynthia Shlope. Okay, she's gone. Isabel Mkongwa. Isabel, you just need to unmute yourself. Go ahead. Go ahead, Isabel. I'm not sure what's happened with Isabel's connection. She is unmuted. Let's move to Cynthia Shlope. Please unmute. Okay, Colleen, I don't think they seems to be around. Let me just go to Fiona Ward. Fiona, unmute and go ahead.
That people are not seeing an unmute option, Marianne. We're getting some messages coming to say they can't unmute.
Let me just check.
Maybe while we're waiting, could I ask this question by Arne van Delft to possibly Warren? How do we move forward given the toxic polarization of this topic? Can give some context live. Should I allow Arne to come live?
Sure. Do you want me to respond? Are we waiting?
Please, while we're trying to sort out the technical issues. Yeah, respond to that.
Okay, so yeah, I mean, it really just, you know, I found a lot of the debate unproductive in the sense that people are really, you know, I watched one presentation on ivermectin, and someone, one of the people there said, you know, you really need the science, and this is the science, and there are some papers that don't show any effect and so forth. So in essence, putting science at the center, and then went on to tell two anecdotes that were quite, you know, were obviously not scientific proof, but they were done in such a way as to undermine ivermectin. So I thought that was a disingenuous type of a way to approach science. And so those kinds of things should be discouraged. We really need to be collegial. I mean, South Africa is made up of brilliant scientists, brilliant researchers, brilliant doctors. And yet the kind of discourse that goes on is a kind of dismissive approach to people who've got different ideas. And really it should be that working on things together, we should be able to find solutions. And certainly I get the sense a lot of people haven't read all the research. They make off the cuff comments. They base quite a lot of their thinking just on what's going on in the media rather than having bothered to study the various research. So I guess those would be just some, in a way, it's ethics in the context of a pandemic, is that you have to do the work and be collegial.
Yeah. Marianne, have we sorted out what the problem is, or shall I ask another question from here?
I think ask another question. I'm just waiting for Kurt to
Okay.
check what's going on in the background.
Okay, there's this question interests me, and I think if Andy, if you're here, because I can also respond to it, is, hi, the producer of ivermectin, Merck, has warned against its use for COVID-19 treatment. What do we make of that in the current context? Andy, could you take that, and then I'll follow on if you don't cover what I would say. Is Andy still with us?
Yes, he is.
Andy, can you unmute and respond to that question? Anissa, would you like to respond to it?
Thanks, Colleen. It's actually strange that a company that has donated a drug for use for as long as it's needed, for as many people as it's needed, you know, and then this has been done through their donation program, the Mactuzam donation program, you know, that they would come out and say that, you know, it's not effective or should not be used. It's just, I'm not sure what the fear is, whether there's some incentive, whether because the patent is gone, whether there's no financial incentive in terms of exploring ivermectin, and maybe this has changed to other drugs or they've got other interests. I mean, one has to look at, you know, that when it comes to, because I can't understand why a cheap drug that's available, that's effective, that's safe, should not be used in a pandemic where, you know, healthcare workers are dying, patients are dying. It just defies logic.
Yeah, and if I can add on to that, in last week or 10 days ago, Merck had to stop their vaccine trial. It's point one. Point two, they've just bought out a company that has got some antivirals. And thirdly, there's no money for them anymore in ivermectin. They can't make any out of patent, so it can be created by any pharmaceutical company across the globe. So there's absolutely no interest for them to do that. And it was safe enough for them to allow it to be dispensed by people who did not have formal qualifications, healthcare workers who are basic healthcare workers. So that statement has caused a lot of confusion across the globe and a lot of suspicion from public. It has gone on, it's on the hour now. Marianne, shall we continue with some of these questions, or do we have to stick strictly to our 1 hour?
Colleen, we don't need to stick to 1 hour, so we can continue. Thanks.
Okay. There were a couple of questions for you earlier about masks, Warren. I can't find them now. It was to do with how long a virus could actually live on the mask. So if people were wearing a mask, how long would the virus stay on the mask?
Yeah, I actually just typed answers to those, but I can quickly answer them if they would be useful. But yeah, so the one question was something about surfaces. How long does the virus stay on a surface, and is it infectious and so forth? So there are studies that show that the virus survives for a long time on a surface, but the technicalities of getting enough virus on your fingers and putting it in your eyes, mouth, or nose are such that the chances are very, very low. So the general guidance is that that's not really where the main risks lie. It doesn't overwhelm the idea that you would have to keep, that you shouldn't wash your hands, or you should wash your hands. That should continue, particularly on commonly touched surfaces, but the risk is quite low. And then the other one was something about mask reuse. So I wasn't sure if certainly if you're sharing masks, it's a big problem between people. But for someone using a mask over an extended period, it just depends on the level of exposure. You know, if they were using it in a taxi, let's say, and people were coughing, and there was potential for that mask to end up with virus on it, then maybe it would be a risk, depending on whether you used it inside out or something like that. But the risks, again, are mostly low. But washing a mask every day or a couple of days is a good practice.
Okay, we've got another question here from Dr. Katrada. Said, please can you comment on the government's stance when it comes to issues like the vaccine versus issues like masks and ivermectin? Government and the NCCC, in essence, made every effort to get trials going for vaccines, using up all available resources in one basket. What about sharing resources? What is your opinion on the new way of policy changes in the face of a pandemic? Andy, you weren't around for your previous question. Can I throw that one at you? Andy, I think you might be muted. Marianne, I don't think he's muted on his side. Is it muted from here? Andy, we can't hear you. Just hold on. We're going to try and see what's happening. Just hold on.
He's not muted. Sorry, Colleen, he's not muted on my side.
Oh. Sorry, Andy, we're unable to hear you. Have you checked? Okay, so there's an issue there. Warren and Anissa, would you like to comment on that?
Sorry, Anissa, do you want to kick off on that one, or otherwise I'm happy to answer it?
Warren, you can go ahead, as it deals with a lot of policy, and that I think you'd be better positioned to answer that. Yeah.
All right, no problem. So, hi Nasiba. So the core thing is that I mean, a lot of my experiences with the HIV epidemic, I've worked in HIV for the past 30 years, and there's been a lot of resources pushed into vaccines around for HIV, massive amounts of resources over the years. And one does eventually ask the question, could those resources have been better spent on other aspects of the epidemic?
We seem to have lost Warren. Anissa, have you got a comment? And Andy, if you can just pitch in at any point, if I can hear you, I'll give you the mic.
Sorry,
Anissa?
I just lost the question. There's so many questions I'm looking at.
Let me go back to it. It's from Dr. Katrada, asking about the government putting all the eggs in one basket of the vaccines currently, and ignoring or neglecting other issues. Let me see if I can find it. It was at 10:58.
I can carry on if
okay, we got you back.
I got disconnected for some reason, but anyway, yeah. So I mean, certainly vaccines are very appealing because they seem like an absolute solution. But the core thing to know about vaccines is that the amount of money spent on developing vaccines and creating them is a fraction of the cost of implementing a vaccine program. It costs 10, 15, 20 times more to get the implementation going, especially in a country like South Africa, where you're going to have to be moving around rural areas and so forth. The double dose means you've got to ensure that people get both doses and so forth. So there's a bit of obscuring of what the real costs of vaccines are. But certainly there's not been a rush to put as much emphasis on therapy. It's quite surprising that Ivermectin, for example, has seemed like a promising therapy, yet all the trials that we have and everything that we have going on has got no investment in it. It's all done by people on the fly on kind of small scale budgets and so forth. So there's certainly an imbalance of resources.
I'm going to take one more question because we have to close in the next minute or so. I wanted to clarify, if you contract COVID and it escalates to a point of significant severity, can your doctor obtain ivermectin for you on a case basis? Currently, I can answer that, yes. There have been some Section 21 bulk applications approved. So across the country, there are permissions to import the drug. Another question came up. Currently, SAHPRA has to look at the quality of the drug, and they've done no quality controls on local manufacturers. So the imported drug at the moment needs to be the one that is used. There will be some more clarity coming in the next few weeks. As you know, that the CCAP is only 2 weeks old. There's very slow getting the drug into the country, getting permissions, etc., but it will be available on the controlled compassionate access program. So I think that SAHPRA has done what it could, and we're hoping that they're going to make it easier. As Warren said, there's still a lot of hurdles that need to be jumped first. And as the evidence comes in, and it's becoming more and more convincing that ivermectin could play a very important role between now and the time we have an effective herd immunity from an effective vaccine. So we're all just keeping our heads on our shoulders, trying to think this thing through, keeping the papers coming, analyzing the papers critically, because some of these papers do need to be critically looked at. They're not just, they're not all of good quality, but the meta-analysis and systematic reviews that are due to come out in the next few weeks should be enough to allow decision-making on easier access to ivermectin. So with that, I'd like to thank everybody for attending. Marianne, I don't know if there's any way of collecting the questions. We might be able to respond to them on a different forum. But for now, I'm just going to thank everybody, and thank you to my speakers, Warren and Anissa and Andy, and to the team for having arranged this webinar. I think it's very important, very timeous, and let's hope it has a long-term effect with people not getting sick. Thanks very much, everybody, and bye-bye.
Thanks so much.
Thank you. Can you hear me now at last?
Yes.
Okay.
Just in time.
I was not avoiding the questions. I was trying to answer some of them on the chat. Some of them are truly scary, like people wanting to inject veterinary products.
Yeah, and injecting their families. I heard about that.
And you know, Warren, your point about exceptionalism, we've been through this with how many drugs already? Ivermectin is not the exception. Ivermectin is just the latest in the range. Exception. And guess what? Next week, it's colchicine.
Yeah.
So there is no exceptional attitude to ivermectin. What is exceptional is the level of promotion of ivermectin. And the sorts of attempts to say that evidence has been reviewed. There was one recently which tried to meta-analyze observational and RCT data together in a single meta-analysis, and then tried to do a quality assessment and said because the RCT wasn't adjusted for confounders, it was of poor quality and threw the RCTs out.
Right.
Now,
Yeah, I think
that's the level of poor science that we are seeing with this one. But we saw it with hydroxychloroquine and Vautrin pushing it, and he's landed up facing disciplinary action in France.
Yeah, the problem is the baby's being thrown out with the bathwater.
The problem is that there is no baby here, Colleen. There is no baby yet. And giving thousands of people something which we just do not know anything about is unconscionable. And especially if we are trying to say that this one molecule is going to work all the way from prophylaxis to severe disease in an intravenous form. It just makes
I think
no
that is
sense.
irresponsible.